Resident Evil 7 was released in early 2017. I didn't end up playing it until 2020, and when I did, I was so impressed I began writing this retrospective. Now, months later, I'm finished, and I'm happy to show you my work. This game excels at being a survival horror, as well as being a Resident Evil game. The bold new direction and new perspective work well for the franchise. The perfect thing to shake up the series. This game had me hooked from the moment I played it, and I ended up finishing it in 4 sittings. Nearly 3, as I was near the end with my last save. It takes inspiration from classic horror movies and blends it with new gameplay techniques, all while taking place in a very believable setting. I will be discussing many aspects of the game, from gameplay, story, theories, and even some possible artistic inspiration. There will be spoilers. If you haven't played RE7 yet, I recommend you do. If you just want to learn more about it, you're in the right place. You play as a character named Ethan Winters, a protagonist that we don't learn a whole lot about as the game goes on. An everyman, in a sense. We learn that, while away on work, his wife has gone missing. It's mentioned that she's on a babysitting job, a detail that completely passed me by during my first playthrough, although it's also a detail that we should keep in mind for later. A cleverly planted seed of information. 3 years pass, and he receives an email from her. The game opens up just after Ethan's drive down south to Dulvey, a bayou town. Resident Evil 7 does a great job of sprinkling just enough information to keep your interest piqued, and yet still maintain a sense of mystery. The game has a strong opening. Within the first hour, we find Mia, find out she's got something wrong with her. She seemingly has 2 sides. The normal Mia that Ethan knows and loves, and the Jekyll to her Dr. Hyde. On and off like a light switch, she bounces between the two. When she's enraged, her face changes, her voice deepens, and she's able to survive fatal wounds. At one point, she thrusts a screwdriver into Ethan's hand, prying it against the wall. Mia then approaches our helpless character with a chainsaw, and while struggling to defend himself, Ethan has his hand cut off. Our character is left holding the bloodied stump in disbelief. You can even pick up the hand and add it as an inventory item. And it's a twisted detail that came as a shock, but is to be expected in an RE game. From here, we dive deeper into the rabbit hole of RE7. We end up in the main home of the Baker family, at a dinner table very reminiscent of that scene in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. A movie, by the way, that doesn't get enough credit. It can be seen as an allegory for the brutal cattle industry disguised as a slasher flick. But that's a topic for another day. Before we know it, we're exploring the house and finding supplies, figuring out puzzles. Ethan progresses his way through the house, and eventually we meet up with Jack for a few boss fights. After the main house, the game opens up to the backyard, an old house, a greenhouse, and a guest house. Much happens along the way, and I think it'd be better for me to explain a little bit more a little bit later. During my first playthrough, I had an interesting thing happen. So, it was during an early boss fight in the garage with Papa Baker. I recognized the setting from some early game footage, and I was aware that car keys needed to be found in the garage, and the car needed to be used to defeat him. Now, I thought this knowledge would give me the upper hand, so I found the keys, I got into the car, put the keys into the ignition, only to be pulled out by Jack, who is now carjacking me. Instead of driving the car into him in this confined space like I expected, I was now trying to stay alive as he began doing donuts while shouting and taunting at the player character. "Ethan! Ethan!" Yelling and whooping. I had a good laugh, but because this completely played with my expectations. As an RE fan, I really enjoyed just how much charm was bursting out of this game. The moment I entered the main hall, I was instantly taken back to the days of RE1's mansion. I'm sure a lot of players felt the same way. It seems intentional in design. The game does a great job of visual storytelling and conveying a message to the player. While searching the house, I stumbled upon an odd-looking door. I remember actually saying to myself, Well, judging by this dead snake crudely nailed to the door, I have a feeling I'm looking for a snake key. For me, this shows a lot of love for the old RE tropes, while presenting it in a way that's new and also fits the setting. Whereas keys of yesteryear were bright and colorful, shaped like hearts, swords, spades, helmets, these keys are grungy with the Bayou Critter theme. This can also be seen as a bookmark for the time it was created. RE7 marks the closest step towards realism for the series. Not total realism, of course, but it's believable enough to draw you in. Sure, they may have a few hidden doors that open with shadow puzzles, but they have the receipts from the construction. Some old items make a return, things like the crank, green herbs, and gunpowder. A player can even execute a quick turn, and that comes in handy. The original Resident Evil titles are special, and they're loved for many reasons. One of them was the fun and intriguing gameplay loops. As you explored, you'd find new items, learn which areas were safe, at least for now, adapt to your setting, and progress on. Puzzles are presented to you, often early on, to stick in your mind so that once you find the item you need, you return and gain some kind of benefit. Often, puzzles weren't even required to finish the game. They would just hide extra items and ammo and upgrades. This gameplay loop, which, keep in mind I'm oversimplifying, is something that's unique and quite fun. It's engaging, and no other games could really pull it off like RE, in my opinion anyway. These tried and true gameplay loops still exist, reminiscent of the old trilogy. Discover, find where you're safe, gather supplies, find new items, solve puzzles, all in a way that matches the new setting. Found a clock pendulum just laying about? Bring it to the grandfather clock you found earlier that just happened to be missing one. The RE games have always had interesting secret weapons, and RE7 follows the trend. On a normal playthrough, it's possible to find a broken handgun, something that I stored away in case it was the solution to a puzzle. And as I played, I found a weapon repair kit, and I instantly thought back to another broken gun, a broken shotgun, which was still sitting in the statue puzzle that I'd placed it in earlier. I also knew where to find a toy gun to replace the broken one with. The whole process felt rewarding. While it was possible to find 2 repair kits on normal, I only found one during my playthrough. My first playthrough, anyway. I was left with a choice to make. A new and improved handgun or shotgun. I happily chose the shotgun. The new shotgun only had 2 shells, but it packed a much harder punch with better range. My choices and the discoveries I had made were all rewarded. In true Resi fashion, the closing moments, there's a monster that's mutating, and you just happen to have access to a powerful weapon. While in the older Resis it would be a rocket launcher, here it's a beefy magnum, appropriately named Albert, which you unlock after completing the game. While reading the description, it mentions it's a prototype for a bioweapon, but it fires like a magnum. The game does a wonderful job with themes of general fears. Claustrophobia is a prominent one, as it makes you squeeze through uncomfortable spaces, between studs and walls, under crawl spaces, things of that nature. Fear of the dark is also used with excellent lighting. This is especially true in the beginning. You walk from the sunny glow of the outside world into a dank, dark room, starting off nearly completely blinded, as it takes a moment for Ethan's eyes to adjust. And wouldn't you know it, the door suddenly slams behind you. I love these moments in games. I feel like it's the first of many go-on I dare ya moments from the developers. They also use fear of bugs and insects to great effect. While squeezing into a tight space, the wall may begin to overflow with insects and creepy crawlies. This is a pretty terrifying thought, and it even had me looking away from my screen at some parts. You got me, game. Most encounters with Marguerite really highlight this theme. She's a woman who gives birth to bugs and can control swarms of them. The audio stands out during these moments. The sounds of scuttling, scurrying, and tiny squeaks of multiple joints moving at once. It's sure to get under your skin if that kind of thing bugs you. Pun intended. And for me it does, and I loved every moment of it. The game also touches on the fear of fire, as well as being burned alive. The fear of an element is primal and as old as time itself. Gruesome thoughts, I know. During one of the videotape viewings, you successfully figure out a saw-like puzzle, only to be rewarded with the viewing of a fiery end for your character. One that the game makes you play out and endure. The fire catches, the small room quickly fills, and you have full control to try to figure a way out. But, of course, there's no way out, and you're left to scramble as you hear your characters start to scream and panic. You're helpless. During this saw-like puzzle scene, you can also find a very interesting room. It's packed from wall to wall with balloons. Definitely an odd sight in a game like this. I found myself tiptoeing in, certain that something was going to jump out of them. This is a very real fear for some people as well. The fear of balloons is actually called globophobia. Body horror is another present theme in this game. During boss fights, you'll often see the Baker family deform into grotesque creatures. The devil really is in the details in these moments. I remember fighting Jack as a boss, and I noticed multiple teeth and eyes and a mandible jetting out from his back during his vulnerable state. In these moments, I couldn't help but think of the movie The Thing and its awesome practical effects. The videotapes themselves offer a unique flair to RE7. They give you a chance to live in the shoes of another character for a bit. This works well because you no longer have the weapons, ammo, and inventory items that make you feel safe. You're in the game's hands now, and you just need to sit up and see what it has in store for you. Will this new character die? Probably, and you're going to find out exactly how. This works well to deliver narrative as well as offer clues to the player of their environment. In an early video, you see a hidden switch being used, and in another, you know the fatal end to a trap. So you think a few steps ahead and complete it without activating the hazards. In this moment, I felt like I outsmarted the Baker son trying to kill me, even though that this is the way to go. This feels like a natural way of discovery. I just wish that there were more tapes, as they prove to be an excellent gameplay tool. RE7 is littered with movie references. Here are a few that I noticed. So there are the obvious ones, like the inspiration from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, with most of the setting. Rotting old house in the south, along with bone and corpse art. Crudely built sculptures made with animal carcasses. Even the murdering father and son through the generations dynamic, all which were present in that movie. Along with the family's affinity for taxidermy, which we learn by examining an animal head in the rec room. Turns out they stuffed it together as a family quite happily. The basement is also filled with chains and meat hooks hanging off the walls, along with dissection tables similar to the ones in Leatherface's butcher room. The influence of the Saw movies can be seen with a death puzzle in a dingy bathroom setting during the time spent with Lucas Baker. I feel like they paid a bit of an homage to Silent Hill 2 as well, with the old put your hand in a filthy toilet routine. I'm sure it was intentional. However, this is also similar to the first Saw movie, so who's to say? And I think it's cool that, in theory, a horror movie fan and a survival horror game fan can both see something like that and read and experience it in a totally different way. During a scene like that, does it make you think of James Sunderland or the first scene in Saw? Which comes to mind first? To me, this is a sign of good art, something that makes you think and people can experience differently. There's a bit of a wink to the Blair Witch Project on the first VHS tape you find, and it's used in an effective way. You're playing a film crew, and suddenly one of your guys wanders off in the house that you're searching in. You search for him, and eventually you find him. He's in the cellar with his back to you. Now, you can wait, but nothing will happen. The game makes the player approach him to find out his fate. This is the type of horror that cannot be replicated in film or book. I had a good laugh when Jack Baker grabbed a chainsaw during a boss fight and yelled out "groovy," an obvious nod to the Evil Dead series. This sparked a thought and had me thinking about the movie The Evil Dead and just the connections to it in general. How similar Ethan's car is to the one used in the movie, and how in the first film, everyone starts out helpless and it's not really clear who's going to survive. A seemingly hopeless situation. For me, this is how the start of the game felt. And I believe it's exactly what the developers intended. My favorite Resident Evil games all have this trait in common. In RE7, you start off with nothing, and then eventually you get a pistol and some ammo, only to find out that they're not going to instantly save you, like the idea behind a gun would. As you explore, you become more comfortable and begin stockpiling supplies, ammo, and healing items. In these moments, you start to feel like Ash from The Evil Dead during the ending portion of the film. You're bloodied, you've seen and survived the horror, you'll probably die, so you might as well drag a few of them down to hell with you. The brilliance, then, comes from the waves that this is presented in. Because before you know it, something unexpected happens, and you end up burning through those supplies. Now you're closer to feeling helpless, rather than an overpowered badass. Another great example of this is the intro of the shotgun. You acquire it in a way that's taken right out of the first RE game. The pistol is just starting to feel crappy when you pick up the shotgun, and holy hell does it shred through enemies compared to the handgun. Back to badass mode. You still need to watch your ammo and trigger finger, keep a level head, and make sure you get headshots, but before you know it, you're stomping through. This makes clearing out the processing basement area much easier. Now, you're outside dealing with a new type of enemy, swarms of insects. Wasps, spiders, and other multi-legged jerks. I loved this because you're still equipped with your awesome ass-kicking weapons, but now you're dealing with something that they don't have much of an effect on. The shotgun bursts won't stop a swarm, so you're back to feeling closer to helpless. That is, until you find a makeshift flamethrower. Now you can burn the bugs and their nests with ease. The game is full of near-death moments. As a player, you can always choose to simply reload a save and use the information you just learned to attack more efficiently, try out a new tactic, or simply go another way. However, during your first playthrough, I highly recommend that you just let things play out. You may have just escaped and are almost out of ammo completely, but don't worry, you will find more. There's a dynamic system in place that provides health and ammo when you need it the most. And it's those times where you only make it out by a hair. Those are the ones that I gain the most enjoyment from out of these games. It's unique to survival horror. As you play, you learn, and the knowledge is power in these games. It's fun to enjoy those early helpless moments, because before you know it, you've become 100% badass. Full Ash mode, as it were. Let's talk about the flamethrower for a moment. While these weapons have been in games for years, I always appreciate it when developers take the time to at least make them look and function in a realistic manner. So the one in RE7 consists of an aerosol can, duct taped to a lit torch with a jury-rigged trigger attached, made out of an old motorcycle handle. Now, as soon as I picked up this weapon in-game, I couldn't help but examine it for a moment, notice how the crude weapon stacked up in terms of realism. It looks like it would actually function as intended. Ammo for the weapon? More aerosol cans, of course. Sure, they're marked burner fuel because, well, video games, but I still appreciated the detail. Some of the other weapons are a little more conventional. Pistols, shotguns, magnums, and a grenade launcher, not including the unlockables. Continuing the RE tradition of unlockable superweapons fits well here in the world of RE7. Much like the older titles, it feels good to replay an area you tiptoed through the first time, only to completely stomp through now. These are usually unlocked for timed playthroughs. An example is beating the game under 4 hours will net you the circular saw, a weapon that makes short work of the Bakers during boss fights and conserves ammo like nobody's business. Let's talk about the settings in the game. So the Baker property is made up of a guest house, a main house, an old house with a nearby greenhouse, a swamp behind the home, and that swamp also contains a tanker ship that the game concludes on. So the guest house acts as a tutorial, and it does a great job of it. It gives off a creepy, abandoned building vibe. There's garbage all around, old, rotting food, roaches, and the whole place looks like it's giving off an ungodly smell. While it's a small area, its limited space is used in an effective way. You always know where you're supposed to go, and the game builds a dark mood, and the pacing is wonderful. During a second playthrough, you will more than likely run right through as quick as you can. But that first time, ooh, it's powerful. The house is so full of creaking and odd but believable sounds. I explored it very cautiously my first time. It's funny because looking back, there aren't any traditional enemies that can actually hurt you there. Only scripted attacks with Mia. Sound is such a powerful tool in horror, something that RE7 is well aware of. The main house consists of rooms for all the Bakers. The old kids' rooms, an attached garage, even Granny Baker has a room, and hers can be found attached to the bar, no less. Nothing wrong with an appreciation for a stiff drink, after all, and I can only hope that I also age with such grace. You start things off in the dining room during what appears to be some kind of grotesque family feast. This moment absolutely plays homage to the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, as I mentioned earlier, while it's still putting its own spin on it. There are 3 generations of cannibals all sitting around the same table with our bound hero. Ethan is then force-fed, and his face is pierced with a large knife, before being interrupted by a phone ringing. We learn that a cop has been sniffing around, and all of a sudden we're alone with the grandmother. After a quick tumble, we're free and now able to explore the house. I'd also like to point out that this was the first moment I began to think about the grandmother's role in all of this. Was she doing this for years? Did she teach Jack the ropes? Had it continued as a family tradition? Or maybe she's in such a severe state that she simply cannot protest to any of the horrors going on in front of her. And if that was the case, maybe she'd be some kind of hidden guardian angel. After all, couldn't she alert the Bakers of my newfound mobility? She doesn't say a word. I made a note of this and decided to keep an eye out for any moments in the game where she appeared friendly or helpful in any kind of way. I did find supplies near her multiple times during the game, I should note. I simply didn't have enough information to make a judgment at the time, so I added it to the pile of curiosities that fueled my first playthrough. The house is full of little details that bring life and make it feel believable. The wallpaper is peeling, there are stacks of old newspapers, dirty dishes in the sink, but there is also family photos of the Bakers. There's also an area in the basement called the processing area, which is appropriately filled with molded enemies and signs of gore. Tight corners, a morgue, grime, metal, surgical equipment litter the floor. It's quite a sight. Now, the old house, closer to the swamp, with just a little bit of a stroll from the backyard, it has a kitchen, a kid's room, and it's infested with bugs. There's also a greenhouse attached to it, which acts as an awesome boss area. Here, the showdown with Marguerite takes place. This was my favorite boss battle in the game by far. You fight a mutated and elongated Marguerite. She'll scurry away from you, start crawling the walls or the ceiling. When she's hidden, she'll give birth to more insects. Because of this, the fight can go from loud to quiet, back and forth, and you just might run into her, lurking around. Let's take a few moments to talk about Mia. We come to find out that Mia has an interesting career background. She's a spec ops agent of some kind, which fits in well with RE's themes. The STARS members were all spec ops, and I couldn't help but think of Jill, Chris, and even old Barry. Let's talk about the Baker family. I found myself feeling a macabre curiosity to the Baker family early on. The game does a great job of painting them as serial killers. All around the house, you'll find odd receipts for saws, rope, and 20 dog collars, along with numerous newspaper clippings and articles of missing people. The basement in the first house you explore, the guest house, is full of bars, cages, torture equipment, and gore. You find Mia in a padded room with a barred door, looking like a prison cell. Upon further inspection, you can see she's left with little more than trash, a shitting bucket, and toilet paper. Who are these people? I wondered as I first strolled these terrible halls. When you make it to the main house, you can find sticky notes on the fridge with people's names, ages, and the meal that they went into, labeling leftovers. These people appear to be psychopaths, murderers, and cannibals. The house is lovingly scattered with photos and sports memorabilia. You learn that Jack and Marguerite have been together for at least 25 years. They've built a home over that time, and it's filled with signs of a real family. Capcom did an excellent job at making the Baker house feel believable. Jack is an interesting character, one you're no doubt familiar with, at least with the appearance from him if you played the demo or watched any of the game footage from pre or post-launch. He was part of the hook. You're stuck in an old house, and this guy lives here with his family. With that said, he's a character that I wish we could have learned more about, delving deeper into his history. We do, however, learn from photos that he's clearly a family man, and that he was in the military as a Marine. He's also a big sports fan. The game does a wonderful job of littering information in the form of random items, files, and it's also effective in environmental storytelling. I just wish that there was more. In the DLC, we learn that Jack has a brother, but I'll talk more about him during the End of Zoe DLC. We face off against Jack in 3 different boss battles throughout the game, 2 of which are arguably the best boss fights in the game. Let's talk about his first one for a moment. So the setting is the Baker garage. You find out that there's a police officer approaching you, asking questions frantically. As he speaks, the garage door begins to close behind him, and the game shows off its affinity for gore in the form of a shovel thrust to the back of the cop's head. Now, you're in a confined space with a shovel-wielding maniac. You know the officer was armed, so you scramble to pick up his gun. You can shoot Jack, sure, but it will only stun him. This may frustrate some players and just may excite others. This means that if you know what you're doing, you can complete the whole fight without using any supplies. However, for a first-timer, there's a good chance that you're going to be frantically shooting, going through health items, and getting tossed around by Jack. In the garage, you can see a muscle car, and the keys are located close by. So in the heat of the moment, it's easy to put the 2 together. However, Jack can pull you out of the car when you have the keys in the ignition, and can carjack you. So it's best to do it with confidence and to make sure that you can get in, start the car, and floor it before he can pull you out. This means that you'll more than likely slam into the walls, back up and forth in a very sloppy manner, and do whatever you can to plow the car into him. And this is exactly what you're supposed to do. Now, the next part reminded me of something straight out of one of the Friday the 13th films. You knock Jack down, and he's just outside of your view. It's silent for a moment, and as you wait for him to get back up, or decide to get out and check if he's dead, suddenly he rips off the roof of the car and begins fighting for control of the steering wheel. You end up smashing into a piece of steel and impaling him, and nearly yourself for that matter. But you're okay, so you get out of the car, and the car catches fire. Out of the blaze walks our guy, Jack. He's severely burned and gets close enough for us to notice all the uncomfortable details. If you're quick, you can make it to the ladder, only to be interrupted by him as he makes you witness shooting himself in the head, removing everything above the bottom jaw. With Jack's teeth exposed and tongue waggling for all those to see, you decide you're finished in the garage. His second fight is arguably the best fight in the game. For me, it's a close tie between this one and the boss fight with Marguerite. In the beginning, you're teased with the final metal dog head that you need for a door puzzle, when suddenly Jack appears in some kind of stupor. You continue down cold brick halls and approach the entrance to the morgue. You're greeted by two large rusty metal doors. They squeak open and close loudly behind you. You're given a moment to collect some supplies, a bit of a wink from the developers that a boss is coming. You see the last dog head once more, ominously hanging over what looks like a gladiator pit from Mad Max. Before grabbing it, you notice a body bag hanging upside down, and you can interact with it, giving it a kick. But instead of giving you any items, Ethan just gives it a swift kick, and you can see its range. I love simple hints like this in games. It's a smart way to teach the player about a new mechanic without having to tell them through text. Anyway, you grab the dog head, and of course it's a trap. Jack grabs you by the face, turns you around, and knocks you onto your back. The fight begins. This fight didn't give me too much trouble on normal, but it did take a few tries to learn what to do. There are body bags hanging, and you can use them to stun Jack, but he is quick. While trying to evade Jack, kicking the body bags in order to stun him, you also need to shoot for the head. Now, at first this may seem like a lot. However, if you switch to your enhanced handgun ammo, he goes down ridiculously quick. On Madhouse, enhanced ammo is pretty much a must-have for this fight, in my opinion, as your accuracy needs to be high, and there's little room for error. Madhouse is the highest difficulty in the game, and I'll be discussing it more a little bit later. After Jack's been shot in the head, he becomes stunned, and his body opens up, revealing fleshy bits, exposed teeth, random eyeballs, body horror in all of its unholy glory. Phase 2 begins as Jack rips open a chain-link fence. He revs a chainsaw, but when you see it, the weapon looks like the love child of a chainsaw and a gigantic pair of scissors. By opening this small area, he's also giving you access to a new weapon, a chainsaw for yourself. So you equip it and you duel. From here, you rinse and repeat the previous stun, headshot, and attack the gore strategy. Only now you have a chainsaw, and if you prefer, you can use just that to defeat him. Beginning a nimble ballet of ripping and tearing as you dance around him, swinging your saw and dodging his swings. Either way, it's intense and satisfying to take him down. The third encounter with Jack isn't nearly as good as the earlier ones. However, they are both hard acts to follow, and I can see where the game was trying to go with this. It's hard to amp things up without going too far. For me, this boss fight felt more like mobile target practice than any kind of struggle for survival. Jack, who's now mutated into a moist abomination, he's covered with bright orange eyes, and these act as obvious targets. I should also mention just how jarring this entire setup felt. You meet up with Mia and Zoe, looking to finally get some answers, and Zoe is surprisingly quiet. You're hot on the tail of Marguerite Baker, and suddenly you're attacked by Jack. To be honest, the first time I played this, I thought I was fighting Lucas. I didn't even realize it was Jack until after the fight was over. Zoe had so much confidence over the phone and had communicated a message that she had some idea what was going on. I found it very surprising that she had nothing to say when Ethan finally was in the same room as her. I don't want to harp on too much about it, as it's not necessarily a bad boss fight. It's just the weakest in a lineup of strong boss encounters. I really hope the RE series makes another entry that stays quiet and grounded like the opening half of this game. It would make a perfect spin-off or a numbered entry. Next, let's talk about the mother, Marguerite Baker, the woman of insects who just happens to give birth to them. She scuttles, she scurries, and generally moves and acts like a bug. During the boss fight, she crumples up like a dying spider when she's hurt, and this will turn into an attack if you get too close. A memorable moment that sticks out in my mind is when she's left laying in a hole, hurt and covered in a thick black goo. You check out the next room, and when you return, you look down and she's gone. If you wait for just a moment, she'll reach out her arm, gangly, lanky, and looking less and less human, resembling an appendage of a stick bug. I jumped down the hole and looked through the newly burrowed tunnel, only to see her scurrying away. Her shoulders were high and sharp. She ran on all fours and moved with great speed as her dirty locks of hair wisped behind her. There was a wet yellow trail left in her wake. Squirming in this paste, you can find small worms. You follow her outside. She's waiting for you in the greenhouse. The boss fight that follows is an impressive one. It's a one-on-one showdown between you and Marguerite. She's now much taller. Her limbs are longer, looking like a hybrid between an insect and a character from Where the Wild Things Are. During the fight, she'll climb the walls, become aggressive with her attacks, and fall back when she's overwhelmed. In these defensive states, she'll give birth to swarms of insects that will pester the player. I had a moment during my first encounter where I lost track of her. The greenhouse has 2 stories, multiple rooms, and vision can be limited. It's pretty dark. As I wandered the main floor looking for her, I stopped for a second, only to realize that I was standing there looking at her. She was standing fully erect with her eyes wide, fixed on me. She began to slowly approach me with this very delicate manner, and it creeped the hell out of me. It was quite effective. Marguerite is an interesting character. I couldn't help but think of who and how she used to be before the infection. I imagine she was a very warm mother to both Zoe and Lucas. The home her and Jack built together shows signs of love and care. I found that this blend of sadness and deranged depravity, they're a great mix for a compelling enemy character. Well, if you can call her that. After all, most of the Bakers, they're just caught up in something much bigger than themselves. They too are victims. I think this adds to the overall horror of the character and the setting in wonderful ways. Lucas, the son of the family, is a bit of an oddball. He likes to torment his victims and gets great joy out of watching people attempt his death puzzles. Exploring his childhood room tells the story of a young boy who grew up curious about electronics and engineering. He won many awards, and he still keeps them on display today. He's used his engineering skills to create, or possibly disguise, a secret attic access ladder in his room. Now, Lucas is one member of the family that stood out to me. For one, it's hinted at that he may have committed murder at a young age and gotten away with it. A troubling note is found in his bedroom and speaks of locking a boy up in the attic for so long that he began to smell and create a stain in the ceiling. This sparked many questions in my own mind. Did Lucas hide this from his family? Did they know and turn a blind eye? Or maybe they even helped him dispose of the body? The big question was, were the Bakers serial killers before Evelyn showed up? And, whether or not they were, it seems clear that Lucas, at the very least, got away with murder long before Evelyn hit the scene. His role in all of this is explained, for better and for worse, in the Not a Hero DLC, based in the salt mines. I'll go into more detail about that during the DLC portion of the video. Next, let's talk a little bit about Zoe. She's a character who I felt bad for. I rooted for her, and ultimately I wish we heard much more from her. Her character is explored a little bit more in the DLC, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about her later in this video. Evelyn, the imposter. Throughout the campaign, information is sprinkled down about Evelyn. We learn that she's controlling the Bakers, and even though she's referring to them as family, she's new to the Baker home. In the DLC, we learn that her presence completely disrupted the Baker family, turning them from loving parents into the twisted creatures they are now. In the base game, Evelyn is a bit of a mystery. She can affect people's minds, appearing and disappearing as she pleases. On top of that, her powers can manifest physically with the black sludge that the molded are made of. This is also what's affecting the Bakers, keeping them prisoner and using them as deadly pawns. Evelyn is clearly inspired by Japanese horror, or J-horror for short. Her character design may remind you of movies like The Ring or The Grudge, and you wouldn't be at fault for mistaking her for Alma from the Fear series. Overall, I found that she added to the variety of horror in the game. Whenever she showed up, I'd often tell myself, okay, prepare for the lights to go out suddenly. The game will probably try to creep me out with the laughter of children. And it successfully did on some occasions. Now let's talk about Mia. Mia appears to be part of the Baker family in the beginning, referring to Jack as Daddy. However, you later learn that she just got caught up in something terrible while working a job. During my first playthrough, I had a moment where I thought to myself, I wonder if this is all just caused by a single thing and a bunch of innocent people just got caught up in the mess. With that single thing having something to do with Evelyn. There's a moment when you appear to have a vision of sorts of Jack Baker. He tells you that they weren't always like this, and that, in fact, it was the effect that Evelyn had on them that made them this way. But who knows for sure? It's clear that Evelyn can get into the minds of whoever she chooses, so would it be so hard to do so to Ethan? And to change or attempt to change his perception of the family? It's mentioned numerous times that she's fixated on the concept of family. Furthermore, it's revealed early on that Ethan can heal just like the Bakers, having limbs violently severed only to be healed to full function moments later. Sure, this could be just chalked up to a game mechanic, but it's possible that this healing is part of Evelyn's gift, a never-ending cycle of regeneration. The grandmother is an interesting character of the Bakers. The woman, who appears nearly catatonic, will keep her gaze fixed on you whenever you're near. She'll appear in different spots around the house, on multiple floors. As I played, I had the feeling that maybe she was trying to help me along the way. Anytime I found her, I noticed that it may be weird, but she never tried to outright harm me. Sometimes there would even be supplies near her. A gift for Ethan? Maybe. There's a point where the player can leave one of the safe rooms, the one just beyond the scorpion door in the main house. As you leave, you walk by her in the hall, making your way around the corner. All of a sudden, she can be heard gently singing. You can pause for a moment and listen to her, or if you turn around to investigate, she's abruptly gone and only silence is left in the air. This was a genuine creepy moment for me, and one that's completely missable. There are two endings, and I especially enjoyed her final scene in the bad ending, in which she finally speaks while possessed by Evelyn. You take the serum and inject it into Evelyn's neck, only to see that it was actually the grandma. Her eyes quickly stream black tears, and her skin begins to melt off in front of you. She repeatedly shouts, "It hurts! It hurts! It hurts!" Twisted and absolutely brilliant. When she began mutating into a wall-like beast, I found myself cheering. While it was a much more bombastic ending than I had originally imagined, I felt satisfied with it. Madhouse is this game's hard mode. Saves are limited to cassette tapes you find, used just like the ink ribbons of yesteryear. The enemies are tougher, Ethan is softer, and there are no autosaves. There are also a handful of smaller changes, such as new antique coin placements, one of the in-game collectibles. This is the difficulty I wish I could have started with, in the beginning at least, one that punishes sloppy play and keeps the stakes high. However, looking back on it, I think it was probably a good idea to lock it off behind a game completion. It's much more likely that a player will finish the game with autosaves, which makes attempting boss fights multiple times much more forgiving. Playing on normal was pretty kind in this regard, but not something that ruins an experience. Odds are, if you beat the game once on normal, liked it enough to go back, you'll enjoy Madhouse. I know I did. Another cool change is that Jack will wander about more freely in the main house, now exploring more of the layout. On normal mode, I notice he's stuck to the second floor. I'm not sure if he follows you out of the area. He certainly never followed me. That's why it was such a good moment when I realized he was loose on Madhouse. The open area on the main floor was no longer safe. He followed me from the second floor through the main open area all the way to the safe room in the kitchen, all while calling out and taunting Ethan, our main character. Something else unique to Madhouse is the Scorpion Key location, which now has to be purchased with 3 antique coins, of the pelican variety. One of 3 new choices in the main open area. Originally, the first appearance of these pay-to-open cages was in the trailer in the backyard. The second boss fight with Jack was the first time I got stuck on this mode. I saved right before the fight, thankfully, and had a clear route there. I died at least a dozen times. I decided to start another file on normal, go for a speedy run, and set myself up for less than 3 heals and only 3 storage box opens. 2 trophies in the game. While searching for tips online, I found a lot of people saying that it's a good idea to first finish the game on easy in under 4 hours to unlock the circular saw, something that can apparently stun-lock the Bakers during their boss fights. I was surprised to learn this information, because many games choose to nullify the trophy or achievement if you use secret and arguably game-stomping weapons. Either way, this approach did not appeal to me. Some of the best moments in these games come from the hard modes, so I loaded up my save, tried again, and died a few more times. Now, I'll admit, I'm more of a frugal gamer when it comes to in-game supplies. I always tend to use the least amount of ammo, trying to stockpile as much as I can. Madhouse does a great job of only peppering you with chem fluid in the beginning. However, you do start to find blue separating agents. This leaves you with a choice. Do you break down something you don't need? And if so, what do you choose? For example, I found out that I could break down psychostimulants for first aid. My supplies were limited, but I did have 4 enhanced handgun bullets, some gunpowder, and a green herb on my route to the boss. So I knew that I'd be able to make more enhanced handgun ammo, as well as some healing items. While this may sound like a minor change, it had a major effect on the battle. Instead of using a full clip to down Jack during the first phase, I could now down him in 4 shots to the head. I could even squeeze in 2 more before he ripped down the fence and grabbed his chainsaw. There were still a few deaths. I worked out a strategy that seemed to evolve every attempt I made until I finally beat him. "Hell yeah," I exclaimed as I delivered the final blow, only to see his top half explode and his legs continue to walk for a few more steps before collapsing. This entire ordeal took time, it took trial and error, and if it was my first playthrough, I may not have persevered. I am happy that I did though, as I learned from that fight, and it was fun to overcome. Another change is the grenade launcher is now given to you, appearing in a different location. This time it can be found right inside the camper in the backyard. During Marguerite's boss fight, I ended up beating her on the first try, but it was a real tooth and nail fight. I chose to leave my shotgun behind in favor of the grenade launcher. This proved to not be the wisest choice, as I ended up ripping through all of my ammo and having to use the knife to finish her off. I have to say though, it was a hell of a fight, and it's exactly how I like my Resident Evil bosses. Challenging and rewarding. Like all great games, there are some critiques on it as well. I'll admit, in the beginning, I avoided playing RE7 during its original release, and regretfully so. While looking at the trailers, I, like many others, wrote it off as a copycat PT, and thought they were trying to make a hide-and-seek horror game like Amnesia or Outlast. I'm not a fan of these. I always much prefer a game that allows you to fight back, even if it's a feeble attempt in the beginning. I was completely wrong about RE7 in that regard. It nails the gameplay loops of older games and delivers in the scares with a new perspective. Is the game perfect? No. But what game is? The final boss, if you can call him that, is more of an interactive cutscene. Some people will find the first-person view off-putting, which is fair. But even if you don't like shooters, RE7 is still worth a try for old-school survival horror fans. The game also has a very strong start and arguably a weaker ending act, but these are hardly deal-breakers. RE7 has a fair size of DLC and a good amount of variety. This includes the cleverly named Banned Footage 1 and 2, which have Nightmare, Bedroom, Ethan Must Die, 21, Daughters, and Jack's Birthday. There's also the Not a Hero DLC, which is a free one, and End of Zoe. While diving into the DLC, I was a bit surprised. I was hoping for more RE goodness, scenarios, puzzles, and story, and I got a bit of a mixed bag. Let me explain. I started off my dive into the DLC by playing Nightmare, which is effectively this game's Mercenaries mode. You're playing as a character named Clancy, and you're trapped in the processing area in the basement of the main house. Here, you'll need to survive until daylight. You're introduced to a currency called scrap, which is constantly being generated by machines. You spend scrap on ammo, healing items, and upgrades, like more health or speed. After my first attempt, I was awarded new weapons for the next go-around. However, I ended up putting it down. Overall, it was a fun mode, but I'm never one to sink too much time into mercenary modes. I usually play these games for the story, the atmosphere, and the spooky times, more than the action. I almost wrote it off completely, but I went back one evening and ended up having a great time. It took a few attempts, but there's a good sense of progress in the unlockables. Eventually, I could buy an item that opened a locked door, which contained another scrap generating machine. So now the mode unraveled into a balancing act, going back and forth between machines, taking out enemies along the way. Another item that tipped the scales was a revive health item, allowing you to get up after dying. Finally, I finished the night and unlocked Night Terror, a more challenging difficulty mode, with 50% less scrap generation and enemies similar to Madhouse difficulty. I happily finished this one on my first go. The next DLC I played was much more up my alley. It's called Bedroom, faithfully named after the setting it takes place in. You're playing as Clancy once more, a poor bloke who's had a few misadventures with the Bakers. Ones that we get to experience through his eyes. He wakes up, cuffed to a bed, scared, tense, and desperate. Clancy calls out for answers as Marguerite enters the room. She's holding a tray with some kind of soup and a spoon. She greets Clancy with her rotting teeth smiling wide. Shortly after, she leaves and we're left to our own devices. You discover that the cuff, while intimidating, is not locked, so you open it up and begin exploring the room. There are a few things in the room you can interact with. Some items are useful, some are there intentionally just to throw you off, and some will make noise causing Marguerite to return to the room. Certain items are used in clever ways. An example is a broken drawer that, if opened, cannot be closed. Marguerite will notice this when she enters the room. You're allowed to have one mess-up as the player, but the second one is when she'll end you. I loved this mechanic. There were a few times I forget one thing or be surprised at just how perceptive she was. I mean, she'll notice if a painting on the wall was moved. And when she calls you out on this, oh man, it is effective. Something about her shrieking. The voice actor is quite skilled in her craft. My first time, this whole scene took me about an hour. I was determined to figure it out all on my own, and I did eventually. That damn hidden knife. The ending even throws you a bit of a curveball. My first time getting the key, I excitedly ran back into the room towards the exit, only to find Marguerite waiting. She rushed me, and of course it's an instant kill if she makes any kind of contact with you. Unless you're armed, that is. In which case Clancy will take a stab at her, and she'll begin writhing and squirming like a bug on the floor. When I first saw this, I was shocked, and I looked at her for just a moment. This proves to be one last trick from the game, because she will get back up. Upon realizing this, I knew I needed to use the time to get the hell out of there, and I only narrowly escaped, but it was all the more memorable for it. While attempting this scenario multiple times, I encountered something odd. At one point, instead of the usual routine, I heard the Bakers fighting in the halls. Things got heated fast, and I only just had time to get everything back to normal and hop back in bed. I was surprised to see Marguerite run into the room brandishing a knife and then start to stab our character wildly. Shortly after, she's interrupted by Jack in an odd moment of tenderness shared between the two. It's enough to calm the beast, and they both leave while speaking their love for one another. As the player, this hurt. There's no way to heal, and you're only allowed one screw-up before failure. It felt totally random, and I loved it. It made me question if maybe it was because I did something a little too early in terms of sequencing. I knew the puzzle for a lock, so I unlocked it and grabbed the item pretty much right off the bat. If that is the case, this is a smart way to catch experienced players off guard. The next DLC is called 21. This DLC took me an hour as well. However, I didn't enjoy my time with it nearly as much as I did the last one. As the player, we're controlling Clancy once more, only in a limited way this time. Now, he interacts with Lucas, the baker's son. He has us locked in a chair, seated at a card table and another death puzzle. Only now, it's a game of blackjack with your life on the line. There's also another man sitting across from you. He has a sack over his head, and his name is Hoffman. It's mentioned that he has a wife and a daughter he needs to get home to, but only one of you will make it out of here. As a bit of a spin on an old game, there's also trump cards. These are special cards awarded at certain rounds and can be found while drawing cards. They have different effects, such as removing your last card, removing your opponent's last card, pulling a 3, 4, 5, 6. You get the idea. The scenario plays out in 3 phases. You need to win a few rounds until your opponent hits bust. Every round the bet goes up. My issue with this game type is just how slow it is. Each hand has to play out, you wait for your turn, and it can't be skipped. Now, I'm not the biggest fan of card games, but I wouldn't say that I dislike them in any way. I ended up having a really good time playing a bunch of poker in Red Dead Redemption 2, but over there you can skip over all other turns. This game is also rigged. You need a certain card at a certain time to make Lucas hit bust rather than just winning through normal means. After 21 is successfully completed, 21 Plus is unlocked. The next DLC is titled Daughters, and this one ended up being my personal favorite. It shines a light on exactly what I was left wondering in the main game, and it confirms my theories with the main story, which is a nice feeling. Now, this may be obvious to some, but for me it was a ton of fun unraveling the tale of the Bakers using only in-game information and avoiding any kind of use of an online wiki. In this mode, you play as Zoe. It begins with a news broadcast shown as a live-action scene. It's explained that there's been terrible flooding in the area down south, and it also mentions a missing tanker ship. Zoe's mom, Marguerite, calls to her from down the hall. Jack suddenly enters the dining room holding Evelyn. She's passed out and has black patches of oil on her. You're tasked with finding her some clean clothes, and it's mentioned that she's going to stay in Lucas's room. This is the second person they've found and taken in. The first, Mia, is in the trailer in the backyard. It's important to mention that all of these characters are in very different states than we're usually used to seeing them in. Marguerite is a frail, older woman who moves with slow, deliberate steps. She speaks with a warm, caring tone of a loving mother. Jack is a concerned older man who's genuine in his attempts to help these people. Lucas is quite shy and quiet compared to the version that we know from the main game. This makes more sense after the Not a Hero DLC, where it's explored what he's been up to. This is exactly what I was hoping for, a peek into the lives of the Bakers before Evelyn was in the picture. The house looks much cleaner, lacking the grime and gore that we're used to seeing. Like a normal family, they have chores on the go, still haven't taken down that plywood or picked up the groceries. This is cleverly used as a means to close off certain parts of the home to tell this new tale. In the main game, we learn that the Bakers are serial killers, taking in drifters and anyone that they can get their hands on to kill and cook, and God knows what else. All under the disillusion that this is some kind of gift from Evelyn. Here we get to see exactly how it played out in the early moments and how the Bakers reacted to it. It's a sad tale, but some of the best stories are tragedies. Eventually, you bring the clean clothes to Evelyn, who's been placed into bed by Jack. He's worried for her, but he says he really needs to check on the boathouse, as it was flooding pretty badly last time he checked. You approach the little girl while trying not to startle her awake. Zoe reaches out her hand, and just then Evelyn looks at her right in the eyes. After a moment's pause, she says, "They're all mine now." And all of a sudden the power is cut, and you're left in the pitch black, hearing the sounds of a child's laughter. Zoe calls out for her dad, Jack, and as the player you can now flick on a lighter as a light source. You fumble around in the dark, trying to find your family members. You come across Lucas, who's passed out on the dining room floor. Eventually, you wander upstairs and find Marguerite in the bathroom. She's looking away from you. You approach and Zoe reaches out to touch her mom's shoulder. Just then, she quickly turns around to display her many gifts in the form of insects protruding from her mouth. Their legs and antennae wriggle furiously as they try to claw at you. Just then, Jack steps in and shields you from her. They struggle, and you can hear in Jack's voice that he hasn't turned yet. A stark contrast in Marguerite's voice, which now has lost its gentle tone. "Kiss me, lover," she shrieks to Jack. He instructs you to go grab some rope from the garage, so you do. Upon returning, you find Jack holding Marguerite's head underwater in the bathtub. "Stop it," Zoe cries out to her father. "Don't worry, it's much worse than it looks," he replies with a giddy grin on his face. This is a moment of true terror when you consider the family dynamic going on. They are Zoe's parents, after all, and they're beginning to commit atrocities, seemingly out of nowhere. It's obvious they enjoy causing fear, pain, and suffering, while just a few moments ago they were warm and loving. From here, Zoe needs to avoid her parents and try to make it out alive. If you fail and are caught by the Bakers, a horrifying scene plays out where Jack punches Zoe in the face, and the two parents drag her off, each holding one of her legs. Zoe screams out, begging for them to let her go. The two people who are always supposed to look out for her are now violently dragging her on the floor. Chilling stuff, and overall it added to the horror of the game and its story. This DLC can play out and end in two different ways. A bad ending, which comes naturally as the events play out, and a true ending for doing some more specific tasks. Both are interesting and worth experiencing. The true ending has an intriguing moment where you need to look over Lucas's shoulder to spot his phone password. This isn't obvious, and it's not repeated, something for keen-eyed players and those using guides. I enjoyed the DLC for the world-building elements. While it's not particularly long, I was happy to enjoy it and loved every minute of it. There's also a rather chilling message said after achieving the true ending. I found it to be quite effective, so I'm going to read it out directly. "Now, Zoe's mundane life has become a struggle for survival. She will spend her days slipping through the grasp of her now insane parents, searching for the serum Mia mentioned in the letter. The nights are marked by the family's murderous feasts, and Evelyn's body deteriorates as months go by. Eventually, Zoe will encounter Ethan, her best hope at finding the serum. But she has a long way to go before that day. So began the horror. The next DLC is much lighter in tone. It's titled Jack's Birthday. Now, this DLC caught me off guard, and I found myself enjoying it much more than I initially anticipated. This one is another minigame, and I'm not usually the biggest fan of these. Normally, I like to try a mode like this out, get a feel for it, and then never return. I don't go out of my way to do this, I just find that I'm more drawn to story and regular gameplay in these games. I'll build the setting. You're playing as Mia, it's Jack's birthday, and you need to feed him food and drink to complete the stage. You find ingredients and meals scattered about the house. You're equipped with weapons, ammo, and healing items to deal with any molded enemies you encounter along the way. All while ragtime music is playing, and there are cartoony sound effects. Sounds of horns and colorful confetti fill the air. Jack, who is sitting at the dinner table in the safe zone, is wearing a colorful party hat and goofy sunglasses and a big red clown nose. The enemies you encounter are wearing party hats as well. Clearly, this entire setup is a stark contrast compared to the main game, and that's entirely the point. This mode is for laughs, and I found myself being drawn in by its absurd charm. With each level, this mode will slowly start opening up and becoming more complex. Some doors will be locked and marked with colors, blue, orange, purple, opening up only after the enemy marked with the same color is killed. You're able to mix food with items like spices, sugar, cheese, and fruit in order to get more points. This can be frantic at times as you're trying to figure out which mixtures upgrade your food the best, all while a timer ticks away. Beer and fruit can be mixed for fruity beer. Spices and chicken can become spicy chicken. You get the picture. There's even a trophy for feeding Jack all of the unique food items. For every enemy killed, there's a pause in the timer for a few seconds. This can be stacked and is quite satisfying to rack up as you plow through a level you're already familiar with, as the enemy and item locations do not change. When you've completed a stage, you're given a rank. Each rank will unlock items for the supply box for future runs. You can unlock upgrades such as increased firepower damage, and this works as a single slot item. Another will more easily point out items to pick up in the area. The more you choose to bring, the less space you have for food and drink, and the same can be said about weapons, ammo, and healing items. Do you take the handgun or shotgun? Or one of each? What about the knife? Or first aid? Will you need it? This means higher risk and higher reward, taking the RE gameplay loop and wrapping it in a bright bow. After a playthrough or two, you'll figure out the quickest route to the highest value items, and those S rankings can be fun to aim for. Not a Hero is a free DLC starring our man Chris Redfield. He's chasing after Lucas Baker, who, if you recall, we never had a boss fight with in the main game. He remained in his human form the whole time, unlike his parents. He's deep within the salt mines, and as the player, we've got to find him. He's captured a number of Chris's men, holding them hostage in his death traps that he has such an affinity for. Upon first playing this DLC, I was a tad underwhelmed. I was excited to learn the fate of Lucas Baker, however, I knew right off the bat that this adventure would be action-heavy, and the slow pacing of the early main game would be absent. For the most part, I was right, and I even ended up taking a break from this DLC, completing it months later after picking the game back up again. My second sitting, however, was much more enjoyable, and I found it picked up greatly near the end. My first playthrough took about an hour and a half. Now, one issue with adding more action to a survival horror game is that it can leave a player feeling numb. You're no longer trying to survive, but rather plowing through, clearing out rooms with a high-powered shotgun, handgun, and 3 types of grenades. With the added firepower, the only thing the developers can do is throw tons of enemies at you, use bullet sponges, and enemies that are somehow immune to your shots. The latter feels about as lame as it sounds. There's even a confusing enemy that gives the message that it's immune, only to be a boss fight later when it suddenly can be hurt by bullets. This whole fight felt like an odd wink to the RE5 version of Chris, in the sense that you need to shoot the legs of a giant molted in order for it to fall to its knees so Chris can wind up and punch it. This method kills it, by the way. During my first playthrough, I couldn't help but laugh at how all this played out. After this boss fight, the game grabbed my attention again. It turns out the salt mine is attached to some kind of underground facility. The sterile walls and empty hallways give off Umbrella Nest vibes. Here, you can discover that they've been doing some testing on the molted, and there's evidence that both Mia and Evelyn have been here. One of the rooms has padded walls and an observing window. It also turns out that Lucas has been working for the facility and leading some kind of testing. Now, while this is all a bit of a stretch, it did have me thinking. The Daughters DLC shows that Evelyn showed up near the Baker property. Was this on purpose? Lucas acts normal and not necessarily his zany self that we know from the main game, which could be caused by the effects of the molted, sure. But he could be hiding the fact that he knew she'd be found. Was she planted there? Or maybe Evelyn got into Lucas's head and wanted all these events to play out just the way they did. Who's to say? But I always enjoy a story that has me asking these kinds of questions. This DLC ends with an impressive boss fight, one that reminded me of the tyrant fights of old and encounters with William Birkin. As Chris, we finally track Lucas down. He no longer has any walls to hide behind. While backed into a corner, he accepts that his time has come. His flesh begins to bubble, pusculate, and melt away. "Oh, this is what it feels like," he says as he transforms into a hulking, molted version of himself. He staggers toward you with one arm dragging on the floor. Sharp, jagged pieces jet out from his body. Pus overflows from his more delicate areas. This boss has good mobility and will soak up damage while dishing it out. This is the kind of boss fight that I was hoping for to end off the main game. After a delicate dance of shotgun fire, maneuvering, and healing, he finally fell. A video shows Chris standing over him, the remnants of Lucas's face displayed under a pustule near the shoulder. "Game over," he says, and he erupts Lucas's face, leaving him as a wet smear on the floor. Overall, this DLC was a fun time. It's important to know what you're getting into in terms of action, but for the final boss fight alone, it's worth it. As a free DLC, this is an awesome gift from Capcom to the fans. End of Zoe is the final DLC that I played. This one takes place mainly in the swamps and stars Jack's brother, Joe. Joe was previously unmentioned in the main game. However, this proves to be an interesting move by the developers, allowing you to take steps in the shoes of one of the Bakers. Joe's main weapon? Why, his 2 fists, of course. In the beginning cinematic, we learn that after Zoe wasn't chosen to receive the serum, she was left at the dock and told that they'd send help for her. Zoe has heard it all before, though, and instead of waiting to die, she wanders off into the swamps. But Evelyn won't allow her to just walk away, so she begins to crystallize and becomes immobile. This is how Joe finds her, statuesque and frozen in time. He picks her up and brings her back to his shack. "I won't let anything happen to you, Zoe. You're my family," he says. The entire area is also becoming locked down. Umbrella has begun the quarantine procedures. Concrete walls are being built up and men in tactical gear with assault rifles are roaming about. Joe struggles with one but ultimately overpowers him. The soldier informs Joe and the player that Zoe can be helped, She needs a serum, and there's one not far away. And so the adventure begins. The melee combat feels smooth, and it reminds me of the Condemned games, if you've ever played those. Right trigger swings your right fist, left trigger swings your left, that kind of thing. There are also 2 combos as well. These become more necessary later, and especially for boss fights. Punching is encouraged throughout the adventure. You can find boxer effigies, items that boost your melee damage by 1 or 10%. There's also a trophy for completing this DLC with fists only. A fun excursion that I recommend to try out. I did so on my first playthrough. This proved to be a challenge in a strange way once I encountered the 4-legged molted. I ended up hitting a hard roadblock. These damn things were just too fast, and I kept dying over and over at the same part. I ended up lucking out and finally killed him, only to be hit by another roadblock when I found the next 4-legged one that couldn't be stealth killed. Oh, by the way, you can stealth kill the molded now, which looks about as odd as it sounds. Curious about this, I checked out at some forums online, and it turns out that some people were having the same issue. Well, a lot of people, in fact. One thing that should be known is after a few deaths in the game, it will ask you if you want to bump it down to easy mode. This makes enemies, including the 4-legged molted, much easier to kill. And it doesn't negatively affect your trophies or achievements. Something to keep in mind for you trophy hunters out there, wanting to spare yourself some time and frustration. As you play, you'll find other weapons as well. Throwing knives and spears, for example, and you can unlock guns and other weapons for beating the DLC, in true Resi fashion. In keeping up with the swampy theme, you can also find critters which act as healing items. Grubs, centipedes, crawfish, all can be mixed for better healing items or simply eaten raw. A squirmy animation that grossed me out every single time I saw it. You'll encounter new enemies along the way too. A double-bladed molted makes an appearance a few times, along with a swamp man boss, and a standout newcomer, at least for me anyway, were the gators. Big, angry alligators that open their gaping maw as you approach. These animals are great for adding tension to the waters. And sure, you can call them simple obstacles that follow basic paths, but they do a great job at building the atmosphere. In terms of story, there isn't much to go into other than what I mentioned. Although Zoe is in the title of this DLC, she hardly has any lines, which I felt was a missed opportunity. Joe, our character, and brother to Jack, isn't really expanded upon as a character. He has a few voice lines and mentions family, sure, but we don't learn where he was during the events of the main game. There is a bit of a reveal near the end of the DLC, which I won't spoil, but it's nothing earth-shattering, and it's info that is contained within the DLC, rather than something explained from the main game. We do get to see what the main hall from the Baker home looks like after it's been quarantined, which is an interesting sight. Overall, I enjoyed my time with this DLC. Personally, I was hoping for more story information, but for what it is, it's a good time. I picked up RE7 for $10 Canadian. I also picked up the season pass for the DLC for another $15. I can say that it was well worth the price of entry. The main game is a greatest hits title now, costing about $20, and it's absolutely worth that price. If you've never played RE7, then maybe this video has highlighted enough of its strengths for you to give it a try. I recommend it to RE fans and newcomers alike. It's not an Outlast clone, nor a meager attempt to be PT. I'm Jesse Bird, and thank you for watching.
Hello, thank you so much for watching my video. I'm Jesse Bird, and please consider supporting me on Patreon if you like this kind of content. I plan on making more, and for everyone who donates $10 or more, I will add your name to the end of my video. Thank you again, and have a great day.